Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. The Virginia Company of London recruited young women to become wives for the planters in its new colony in Jamestown. Though the women had all gone of their own free will, they were to be sold into marriage, generating a profit for investors and helping ensure the colony's long-term viability. Who were the English women who made the Atlantic crossing, and what happened to them when they arrived? Let's learn more about this fascinating part of colonial history as told by the Not Just the Tudors podcast.
Your story starts in 1621, and we're tracing the lives of English women recruited as brides for planters in Jamestown in the colony of Virginia.
I look on these women, they have every right to be called the founding mothers of America. We hear about the founding fathers, but some of these really are the founding mothers, although I suspect not many of them survived long enough. But I look on them with huge admiration.
I'm interested to understand how families and the women were enticed to give a daughter to an investment opportunity to wed a man they'd not yet met on the other side of the world. Did they apply a certain amount of spin?
I think the company absolutely would not have been honest or completely transparent about how dangerous life was in Virginia. I think there's no doubt about that. It promised the women a free choice of husband, although at the same time there were complaints from poorer tenants over in Virginia that if they didn't have enough money to put up the bride price, they were kept away from the women. The way the Virginia Company got most of its young men was to put up posters advertising the fact that it wanted all sorts of tradesmen. And of course, not everyone could read in those days. And certainly not very few women would have been able to read unless they were highly educated. So these broadsides would be put up in marketplaces and people who could read would read them out for other people. But I don't think that's how it found these women. I think one of the main ways, and we know this from the guarantors who are in these lists, that it asked that a lot of Virginia Company officials and investors put forward their family. Even Sir Edwin Sandys, a relative of his, a woman called Cicely Bray, who was the daughter of gentlefolk of good esteem, and she was described as being of kin to Sir Edwin Sandys, so he put her forward. Another, Catherine Finch, whose brother was crossbow maker to the king. And I worked out that he probably knew quite a lot of people within the Virginia Company. Sometimes it was lowly people within the Virginia Company. One of the women whose Virginian life I follow was recommended by Robert the Porter. And I actually found a Robert Peasley, I think he was called, who was a porter for the Virginia Company, who got his job when the previous incumbent as porter was caught taking tobacco out of one of the warehouses, stuffed up his trousers. It is extraordinary, the small details that you can find in these very dusty documents that every now and then would make me laugh. But I think that is the main way the company drew in these women. Also, a number were recommended by what I would call the great and good of the City of London. The two lists give me the names of 56 women, and about half of the women, by the time they left for Virginia, although they'd come from all around, mainly southern England, more than half were living in London. Either they were London-born or they were living in service with people in London. And that was a natural stage in a girl's life between mid to late teenage years to when they got married. Why families would recommend them or why the women themselves would want to go. At the time, early 1620s, England was suffering an economic crisis. There'd been a crisis in the wool industry and people were generally feeling really very poor. Now, as a woman, you were expected to marry. Whatever you wanted for yourself, that was really the only way you could get your place in society. And at the time, there was a great hike in dowries. So families would have found it very hard to raise enough money for the dowry. But it was particularly difficult to find a husband in London because 1 in 6 of the women from the 56 that I look at were gentlefolk or related to gentry. The dowries for those women would have been really quite high. For what I call the middling women, I would say the bulk of these 56 had male relatives who were in respectable trades like bakers, and there was a fustian dresser and vintners and crossbow makers. The young men in London whom they would have hoped to marry would have served long apprenticeships that would last about 7 years when they weren't allowed to marry. And at the end of their apprenticeship, the young men, many of them aspired to marry either the master's daughter, which would help set them up in a trade, or they wanted to marry widows who would again help them to set up. Another of my sources for understanding what it would be like for these women were ballads. And there are some wonderful maidens' lament about the difficulties of finding a husband.
So once these women had been volunteered and chosen, how were they prepared and provisioned for their new lives? I mean, even the prospect of the journey, the voyage across the Atlantic would have taken months.
It took them about 3 months, and they set off end of August, beginning of September. So they were setting off at the worst possible time for winter storms. It would have been absolute nightmare. The Virginia Company had to get them ready very quickly. They were sent with clothes. They were sent with a petticoat, a waistcoat, 2 pairs of stockings, a pair of garters, 2 smocks, an apron, 2 pairs of shoes, a towel, 2 coifs and crosscloths that you wear over your head, as well as worsted wool for darning and yarn for knitting stockings. It's interesting, they weren't sent with coats. Virginian winters are really cold.
So they would have been wearing everything else at once, I imagine.
Yes, and 1 or 2 of them from the lists, one of the highest born of the women, took a trunk, and if you took belongings with you on the boats, you then signed a manifest. And she was called Joan Edgerton. She was actually a widow, and she came from a very high-born family. I think she was related even to a chancellor. And interestingly, she travelled by a ship called the Marmaduke, which left from the Isle of Wight. And she got to the Isle of Wight, and she was the only one out of 20 men and women who signed the manifest who could sign her own name. None of the men, and there was one other of the Jamestown brides. She was the youngest of the lot. She was just 15, took a small packet of linen, and she could only sign her mark. But Joan Fletcher then never actually travels to Virginia. I think she possibly took fright. She got as far as the Isle of Wight, but then for reasons unknown, she never travelled further. So other people had to be found in her place.
The thought of these women's arrival in Jamestown is mind-boggling. You know, they're arriving somewhere that's very different to a world that they've known before. They knew they were meant to marry, but they weren't free women, because if a man wanted a wife, presumably he had to pay the price. So I wonder if you can imagine for us the arrival and how these women settled.
One way that I tried to imagine what life would be like was to replicate the journey up the James River. Because you cross the Atlantic and then you see this wide Chesapeake Bay, and it would have taken them another couple of days to slowly tack up the James River. And they're arriving now in winter, and there had been a few sites of settlements, but not many. And then they catch their first sight of Jamestown Island. They've left London 3 months ago, thriving city of about 200,000 souls, bustling, noisy, stinking, yes, all that. And they've reached this place in the middle of a wilderness. What they would have seen was there was a triangular fort at Jamestown. There's a wooden church. There's 1 or 2 larger wooden buildings, storehouses, less than 24 houses, a palisade fence, and a wooden landing stage which was in terrible disrepair, if it was even standing at all. Imagine how they must have felt. They've travelled all this way, dreadful crossing, and then they've got to face the whole business of finding a husband in this 6 men to 1 woman sort of situation. You can imagine how they felt when they got onto land.
I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.